The night was January 17, 1942, and the air above the Celebes Sea hung thick with salt and fuel vapor. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Yamamoto gripped the controls of his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, the engine's drone a constant companion in the darkness 3,000 meters below the stars. He had flown 73 combat sorties since the war began 6 weeks earlier. He had seen cities burn. He had watched battleships die. But nothing in his training at Kasumigara, nothing in the textbooks of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, nothing whispered by veterans of the China campaigns had prepared him for what awaited beyond the horizon, not in combat, but in surrender. Yamamoto's squadron had launched from Davao 2 hours before midnight, tasked with a reconnaissance sweep of American positions in the southern Philippines. The mission brief was routine: observe, photograph, return. But engine trouble forced him down over Mindanao, and by dawn he found himself limping toward what intelligence maps identified as a newly captured American airfield near Tacloban. His fuel gauge kissed empty. His radio crackled with static. The choice was no choice at all: land or die. As his Zero descended through the pre-dawn murk, Yamamoto expected darkness. Japanese airfields operated under strict blackout protocols. Night landings were executed with minimal ground lighting, often just a single hooded lantern at runway's end, sometimes merely bonfires in oil drums. Pilots navigated by moonlight, by instinct, by the faint phosphorescence of wave caps if flying coastal approaches. This was warfare, austere, disciplined, stripped to necessity. But when Yamamoto broke through the cloud layer at 400 meters, the world beneath him exploded into light. The runway stretched before him like a river of stars, twin parallel lines of brilliance marking its edges with geometric perfection. Floodlights bathed the entire field in cold white radiance bright enough to read by, bright enough to cast shadows sharp as knives. He could see maintenance crews moving between aircraft. He could see fuel trucks, their metal skins gleaming. He could see the painted numbers on parked planes 200 meters distant. Every building was illuminated. Every taxiway glowed. The airfield did not hide. It announced itself, a blazing declaration visible for kilometers in every direction. Yamamoto's breath caught. His hand trembled on the throttle. In that moment, suspended between sky and earth, he understood with terrible clarity that Japan had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Not about tactics, not about courage, but about the fundamental nature of the enemy they had chosen to fight. This was not the expected face of war. This was something else entirely. To understand Yamamoto's shock requires understanding the world he came from, a nation that had spent 15 years preparing for total war through total sacrifice. Japan in 1942 was a society mobilized to its absolute limit, every resource calibrated, every luxury surrendered, every citizen conscripted into the machinery of imperial expansion. The transformation had begun in 1937 with the China campaign, accelerated through 1940 with the Tripartite Pact, and culminated in December 1941 with simultaneous offensives across 6,000 kilometers of ocean and jungle. By early 1942, rationing in Japan had progressed from inconvenience to deprivation. Rice rations had been cut 3 times. Sugar was a memory. Cooking oil was rationed to 300 milliliters per household per month. Textile production had been commandeered for military uniforms, leaving civilians to patch and repatch clothing until fabric wore translucent. Metal, every scrap, every fragment, was collected for munitions. Temple bells were melted down. Kitchen pots were surrendered. Children scoured roadsides for discarded nails. The military existed in a state of perpetual scarcity. Japanese airfields operated on threadbare budgets even before Pearl Harbor. At Tainan Air Base in Taiwan, mechanics cannibalized 3 damaged Zeros to keep 2 operational. At Kisarazu, Pilots practiced carrier landings on strips marked with chalk because paint was reserved for camouflage. Night operations were minimized not only for tactical reasons but because fuel and electrical generation capacity could not sustain routine illuminated operations. Aviation fuel itself was a strategic nightmare. Japan produced almost no petroleum domestically. Before the war, 80% of its oil came from American wells. Texas crude shipped across the Pacific, refined in Yokohama, and burned by the very forces now fighting American pilots. When Roosevelt imposed the oil embargo in August 1941, Japan's strategic reserves held approximately 43 million barrels, enough for perhaps 18 months of wartime consumption, and that only if used with ruthless efficiency. This scarcity shaped every aspect of Japanese military culture. Pilots were trained to conserve fuel by gliding whenever possible, by flying lean mixtures that reduced power but extended range. Ground crews measured fuel in liters, not gallons, every drop accounted for, every wastage investigated. The concept of leaving lights burning through the night, of flooding a square kilometer with electricity for mere convenience, would have seemed not just wasteful but psychologically impossible, a violation of the fundamental logic by which the military operated. And yet here was an American airfield, technically captured from American forces just 3 weeks prior, operating as if scarcity did not exist. The lights that stunned Yamamoto were not primitive. These were standardized runway edge lights, Model and L7, manufactured by Kraus-Heinz in Syracuse, New York. Each fixture housed a 500-watt incandescent bulb behind a Fresnel lens designed to project visible light up to 5 kilometers. The system included approach lights, threshold lights, taxiway lights, and obstruction markers, all wired to a central control panel in the operations tower. Power came from twin diesel generators, Caterpillar D15000 models, each capable of producing 180 kilowatts continuous output, with automatic load balancing and redundant fuel supply. The American military had not improvised this system. It was standard. Every major Army Air Forces base in the Pacific received the same lighting package, shipped from stateside depots, installed by engineer battalions, maintained by dedicated electrical crews. The lights were part of a comprehensive approach to night operations developed in the 1930s, refined through thousands of training flights, and deployed as routine infrastructure wherever American forces established airfields. This routineness, this casual abundance, formed the core of Yamamoto's shock. The lights were not a special defensive measure. They were not a trap. They were simply how Americans operated every night at every field, because they possessed the industrial capacity to make it so. Yamamoto landed his damaged Zero on that illuminated runway with his mind fracturing. The touchdown was smooth. The lights made it effortless. He rolled to a stop near the dispersal area, killed the engine, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment as American ground crew approached with weapons drawn. He was not thinking about capture. He was thinking about mathematics. His Zero had flown from Davao on 540 liters of fuel. He had been rationed 2 meals per day, rice, pickled radish, sometimes a small piece of fish, for 6 weeks. His squadron shared tools. They patched tire tubes with rubber cut from old shoes. They washed and reused cotton waste for cleaning oil. They operated from airfields where evening meant darkness absolute, where pilots who missed their landing approach sometimes died because there was no light to guide them back. And here was an enemy that left 1,000 bulbs burning through the night without thought, without consequence. The implications spiraled outward. If Americans could afford to flood airfields with light, what else could they afford? How deep were their reserves? How vast their production? Yamamoto had read intelligence estimates of American industrial capacity, but numbers on paper carried no weight compared to the visceral experience of seeing abundance made concrete. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor in part because intelligence suggested America was unprepared, its military aging, its will uncertain. But those lights told a different story. They spoke of a nation that could afford inefficiency, that could choose convenience over economy, that operated from a position of such material superiority that conservation was not a consideration. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots who encountered American installations in those first months of 1942 was profound and well documented. After the war, interviews conducted by American military historians for the Strategic Bombing Survey revealed a consistent pattern. Initial confidence collapsing into doubt, then confusion, then a kind of existential dread as the scale of American material superiority became undeniable. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces with 64 confirmed victories, wrote in his memoir Samurai about a similar encounter during a mission over Guadalcanal in August 1942. His squadron had attacked an American airbase at dusk, expecting to find planes grounded in darkness. Instead, they found the field brilliantly illuminated, aircraft landing and taking off in continuous rotation, fuel trucks moving freely, maintenance proceeding under floodlights as if combat conditions were irrelevant. Sakai described the experience as seeing into another world, one where the basic constraints that governed Japanese operations simply did not apply. The contrast became even starker when Japanese forces actually occupied captured American facilities. On Wake Island, Japanese commanders discovered stockpiles that seemed incomprehensible. Warehouses filled with canned goods, cigarettes, building materials, spare parts still in factory packaging. The American garrison had held just 449 military personnel, yet their supply dumps contained enough material to support a force 3 times that size for 6 months. Japanese troops, many of whom had been on reduced rations since 1937, found themselves surrounded by abundance they had forgotten existed. The airfield on Wake held another revelation, a complete mobile lighting system still in working order. American engineers had installed not just fixed lighting but portable units on trailers, allowing them to configure runway lighting rapidly as wind conditions changed. Each trailer carried its own generator, its own fuel tank, its own reel of cable. The redundancy was staggering. Backup systems for backup systems, all functioning, all maintained, as if the possibility of shortage had never been contemplated. 4 Japanese engineers examining the equipment, the implications were clear and devastating. America was not fighting a war of scarcity. It was fighting a war of excess, of surplus, of having so much that waste became acceptable. This was not an enemy that could be bled dry through attrition. This was an enemy that could absorb losses and rebuild faster than those losses could be inflicted. The runway lights became a symbol that haunted Japanese military thinking throughout the war, a tangible representation of the material chasm between the two nations. But they were merely the most visible manifestation of a deeper reality, one rooted in industrial capacity developed over decades. American electrical generation capacity in 1941 stood at approximately 51 million kilowatts, more than the combined capacity of Germany, Japan, Italy, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union together. This was not a temporary wartime surge. It was infrastructure built during the 1920s and 1930s through rural electrification programs, urban development, and industrial expansion. By 1942, 90% of American urban areas had electrical service, and 60% of rural areas were electrified, a penetration rate unmatched anywhere in the world. Japan's electrical capacity in 1941 was approximately 9.5 million kilowatts, most concentrated in industrial zones around Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Rural electrification remained limited. Less than 30% of villages had power. Military bases often operated on independent generators because the civilian grid could not support additional load. When Japanese forces seized American installations, they inherited electrical infrastructure superior to anything available in the home islands. This disparity extended across every category of material. American steel production in 1941 totaled 75 million tons. Japan produced 6.8 million tons. American automobile production exceeded 4 million vehicles annually. Japan produced fewer than 50,000. America's petroleum refining capacity was 12 times Japan's. Its aluminum production was 15 times greater. Its shipbuilding capacity, even before wartime expansion, could output tonnage equal to Japan's entire merchant fleet every 18 months. These numbers were available to Japanese planners before Pearl Harbor. Naval staff officers knew the figures. The problem was that numbers remained abstract until experienced personally, until encountered in the field in forms that could not be dismissed or rationalized away. Runway lights were concrete. Floodlit airfields were undeniable. And once seen, they transformed intellectual knowledge into emotional comprehension. The psychological mechanism at work was cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs. Japanese military ideology insisted on spiritual superiority compensating for material inferiority. The Bushido Code emphasized courage, discipline, and willingness to die overcoming enemy technological advantages. This belief structure worked, barely, when material disparities were modest or could be offset through tactical innovation. But it collapsed when disparities became so extreme that no amount of spirit could bridge the gap. Yamamoto Isoroku, the admiral who planned Pearl Harbor, understood this intellectually. His famous observation after the attack, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," reflected his grasp of American industrial potential. But even Yamamoto underestimated the speed and scale of American mobilization. He calculated that Japan had perhaps 18 months to achieve decisive victories before American production reached overwhelming levels. In reality, American output began surpassing Japanese production within months of Pearl Harbor, and by mid-1942 the material imbalance was already becoming insurmountable. The story of American runway lights is inseparable from the broader story of American strategic bombing doctrine and the infrastructure required to support it. While Japanese forces developed carrier-based aviation as their primary striking arm, America invested heavily in land-based bombers and the extensive ground infrastructure needed to operate them effectively. This divergence in strategic approach reflected different geopolitical realities, but it also reflected different assumptions about what kind of war was being prepared for. Japanese airfields were designed for mobility and rapid deployment. Carrier-based aviation dominated because Japan's strategy focused on naval campaigns across the vast Pacific. Land bases were seen as temporary staging points, to be established quickly, used intensively, then abandoned if necessary. Infrastructure was kept minimal. Packed earth runways, tents for personnel, dispersed aircraft parking to minimize bomb damage. The entire Japanese air service could pack up and relocate in hours if required. American airfields, by contrast, were designed for sustained operations from fixed locations. The Army Air Corps, later Army Air Forces, doctrine emphasized strategic bombing, long-range missions requiring heavy bombers, extensive maintenance, significant fuel and ordnance storage, and the crew facilities to support continuous operations. This required permanent infrastructure, concrete runways capable of handling 30-ton aircraft, hardened revetments, fuel depots with thousands of barrels in reserve, barracks for hundreds of personnel, machine shops, armories, communication centers, and all the electrical power to run it all. The lighting systems that stunned Japanese pilots were part of this comprehensive infrastructure. They existed not because American planners anticipated the psychological impact on enemies, but because they were necessary for the operational tempo American doctrine required. Heavy bombers returning from nighttime missions needed guidance to land safely. Damaged aircraft needed immediate maintenance regardless of the hour. Round-the-clock operations meant ground crews working in shifts, and working meant visibility, and visibility meant lights, thousands of them, burning continuously, powered by generators that consumed fuel at rates that would have bankrupted a Japanese base commander. The scale becomes comprehensible through specific examples. Clark Field in the Philippines, before its capture by Japanese forces in December 1941, had electrical infrastructure sufficient to power a small city. The base lighting system included 847 individual runway and taxiway lights, 94 floodlights for aircraft parking areas, and 267 building interior fixtures, all powered by a central generating station with 3 diesel generators totaling 540 kilowatts capacity. The generators consumed approximately 3,800 liters of fuel per day under full load, more fuel than an entire Japanese fighter squadron would use in a week of combat operations. When Japanese forces captured Clark Field, they found the lighting system still functional despite American demolition attempts. Local commanders ordered the lights kept operational, reasoning that they provided significant tactical advantage for night operations. But maintenance became a nightmare. Japanese engineers lacked replacement parts. The American Krauss-Heinz fixtures used bulbs with Edison screw bases different from Japanese standards. When bulbs failed, they had to be replaced with scavenged American stock, and once that ran out, entire sections of the lighting system went dark. More fundamentally, Japanese commanders struggled with the fuel logistics. Running the generators at Clark Field consumed more petroleum in a day than some forward bases received in a week. Choices had to be made: light the runways or fuel the fighters, run the generators or supply the trucks. These were decisions American base commanders never faced because their supply lines simply delivered whatever was needed, in quantities sufficient to eliminate choice. The American logistical system that supported this abundance was itself a marvel that Japanese forces could not replicate. The Army Service Forces, responsible for supply and logistics, employed over 1.8 million personnel by 1943, nearly as many people as the entire Japanese Army Air Force. This vast bureaucracy managed supply chains stretching across oceans, coordinating production, shipping, warehousing, and distribution with industrial efficiency that treated waste as acceptable overhead rather than crisis. Petroleum exemplifies the system's scale. The United States produced approximately 1.4 billion barrels of crude oil in 1942, roughly 65% of global production. Of this, approximately 170 million barrels were allocated to military use. The logistical network to move this oil to where it was needed involved 400 ocean-going tankers, thousands of coastal vessels, 150,000 kilometers of pipeline, and storage facilities with capacity exceeding 30 million barrels. When an American airfield in the Pacific needed fuel, it requested a quantity, and that quantity arrived, not always immediately, not always without delays, but with predictable regularity that made planning possible. Japan, by contrast, entered the war with 43 million barrels of petroleum reserves and domestic production of approximately 4 million barrels per year, less than 3% of American output. Capturing oil fields in the Dutch East Indies added production, but those fields required security, the crude required refining, and the products required shipping across seas increasingly dominated by American submarines. By 1943, Japanese tanker losses exceeded new construction, and by 1944 the empire was starving for oil even as millions of barrels sat in storage tanks in Sumatra and Borneo, unreachable across submarine-infested waters. The psychological impact of encountering American material abundance extended beyond the initial shock of runway lights. As the war progressed and Japanese forces found themselves increasingly on the defensive, occupying captured American installations and equipment, the corrosive effect on morale deepened. Japanese soldiers opening American ration crates discovered another world. A standard American K-ration, issued to frontline troops, contained canned meat, hardtack biscuits, cigarettes, candy, instant coffee, sugar, chewing gum, matches, and toilet paper, all in a single daily pack weighing 1.5 kilograms. The variety stunned Japanese soldiers whose daily ration by 1943 had been reduced to rice, sometimes supplemented with pickled vegetables if supply lines held. Chocolate was a rumor. Coffee was a peacetime memory. Cigarettes were rolled from whatever scraps of tobacco could be procured. The contrast in medical supplies was equally stark. American field medical kits contained morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, sterile bandages, plasma, and detailed first aid instructions. Japanese kits by 1943 often contained little more than iodine and cloth bandages, with morphine reserved for officers. Wounded Japanese soldiers in New Guinea reported seeing captured American medical supplies and feeling a despair deeper than their injuries, the realization that even in pain relief, even in basic care for the wounded, their enemy operated from abundance while they suffered scarcity. This disparity was not accidental. American military planners had made a deliberate decision to prioritize troop welfare and morale as force multipliers. Well-fed troops fought better. Comfortable troops maintained discipline. Troops who knew their nation could afford to give them chocolate and coffee believed they were fighting for a society worth defending. The decision to include cigarettes and candy in rations was not humanitarian. It was coldly pragmatic, calculated to maintain fighting effectiveness through material demonstration of national strength. Japanese military culture took the opposite approach. Bushido ideology glorified suffering and sacrifice. Hardship was considered character building. Complaints about food or conditions were signs of moral weakness. This ideology worked, to a point. It produced soldiers of extraordinary courage and endurance. But it also produced soldiers who, upon encountering the material reality of American logistics, experienced not just shock but profound disillusionment. The ideology promised spiritual superiority would overcome material inferiority. But when material inferiority was so extreme that no amount of spirit seemed sufficient, the ideological foundation cracked. Diaries and letters recovered from Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific tell this story in intimate detail. A private stationed on Bougainville in December 1943 wrote to his family, "Today we captured an American supply dump. Inside were crates of canned peaches, cigarettes by the thousands, chocolate bars, condensed milk, coffee. We ate until our stomachs hurt. The first time in months we have been full. But afterward, I felt only sadness. How can we defeat a nation that gives its soldiers peaches?" Another soldier, captured on Saipan in July 1944, told his interrogators, "When I saw how American wounded were treated, flown to hospital ships, given real doctors, real medicine, I understood why you fight so well. You believe your nation values you. We are told we are valued, but we are given rice and told to die. Your runways are lit like cities. Ours are dark because we have no fuel for lights. These facts tell the truth ideology cannot change." These testimonies reveal the psychological mechanism by which material abundance translated into strategic advantage. It was not simply that American forces had more weapons or better equipment, though they did. It was that the visible, tangible evidence of abundance communicated a message about the nature of the societies in conflict. America's ability to waste resources, to burn fuel for convenience lighting, to include candy in rations, to evacuate wounded by aircraft instead of leaving them to die, demonstrated a depth of societal strength that Japanese ideology had no answer for. The runway lights also represented a specific technological philosophy that diverged sharply from Japanese approaches. American military technology emphasized standardization, mass production, and redundancy. Equipment was designed to be manufactured in enormous quantities, to be maintained by semi-skilled personnel using standardized parts, and to function reliably under varied conditions with minimal adjustment. The Krauss-Heinz and L-7 runway light exemplified this philosophy. The design was intentionally simple: a cast aluminum housing, a standard Edison base bulb, a Fresnel lens, and weatherproof gaskets. Any reasonably competent electrician could install it. Any soldier who could read basic instructions could replace a bulb. Parts were interchangeable across thousands of units. If one fixture failed, operations continued unaffected because redundancy was built into the system. Lights were spaced every 30 meters, far exceeding the minimum required for safe operations. Japanese military technology, by contrast, emphasized quality, precision, and artisanal expertise. Equipment was often superb. The Zero fighter was arguably the world's best carrier-based aircraft in 1941. But it was also difficult to manufacture, requiring skilled labor and precision tooling. Field maintenance demanded expertise. When parts failed, replacement required custom fabrication or cannibalization from damaged equipment. Systems lacked redundancy because resources did not permit backup units sitting idle. This philosophical difference had cascading effects. American forces could sustain operations despite casualties, equipment damage, and supply disruptions because their systems were designed to tolerate failure. Lose half your lighting fixtures? The runway remains operational. Lose half your mechanics? Semi-skilled personnel can keep equipment functioning. Lose half your pilots? Training pipelines produce replacements in months. Japanese forces, operating with precision systems lacking redundancy, suffered catastrophic failures when disrupted. Lose key maintenance personnel? Aircraft sat grounded because no one else had the expertise to repair them. Lose skilled pilots? Replacements required years of training to reach equivalent proficiency. Lose access to specific spare parts? Equipment became unflyable even if otherwise undamaged. By 1943, these systemic differences produced dramatic operational consequences. American airfields in the Pacific operated at high tempo despite combat losses and equipment wear. Japanese airfields, starved for fuel, parts, and personnel, saw operational rates collapse. At Rabaul, once Japan's largest airbase in the South Pacific, sortie rates fell from 50 per day in early 1943 to fewer than 5 per day by early 1944, not because aircraft were unavailable but because fuel, parts, and maintenance capacity had evaporated. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan brought the material imbalance into devastating focus. When B-29 superfortresses began flying from the Mariana Islands in late 1944, they operated from airfields that made the installations of 1942 look primitive. North Field on Tinian, the base from which the atomic bomb missions launched, featured 4 parallel 2,500-meter runways, all lit with complete and L7 systems, all serviced by power plants generating over 15 megawatts. The base could launch and recover over 100 heavy bombers simultaneously, refuel them, rearm them, and repeat the cycle daily. Japanese air defenses, by comparison, operated on desperation. Night fighters flew with minimal ground support because fuel and electrical capacity could not sustain illuminated operations. Searchlight batteries ran out of carbon rods for arc lights and had no replacements. Anti-aircraft batteries rationed ammunition because production could not match consumption. The asymmetry was crushing. American bombers flew from bases that never went dark, while Japanese defenders scrambled from fields where even basic navigation lighting was a luxury. The symbolism of light and darkness became central to American propaganda and psychological operations as the war progressed. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions showed photographs of brightly lit American installations contrasted with dark Japanese positions, accompanied by text, "Your leaders keep you in darkness while America's warriors live in light. Surrender and see the truth." The messaging was crude but effective because it resonated with experiences Japanese soldiers already had. Interrogations of prisoners revealed that captured personnel often spoke obsessively about American material conditions. One pilot, shot down over Okinawa in April 1945, spent much of his interrogation asking questions about American electrical generation capacity, petroleum reserves, and industrial production. His interrogator noted, "Subject seems less interested in military intelligence than in confirming his suspicion that Japan cannot possibly win." Subject repeatedly referenced runway lighting at American fields as evidence of unlimited resources. When asked if he would provide tactical information, he responded, "What does it matter? You have already won. We simply have not admitted it yet." This fatalism became widespread in Japanese forces by 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw Japanese naval aviation effectively destroyed, losing 600 aircraft and most of their trained pilots in a single day. Survivors reported that even before combat, morale was deteriorating as pilots observed American task force movements. Japanese reconnaissance planes reported American carriers operating with lights visible for dozens of kilometers at night, not as errors but as routine practice because American doctrine simply did not require the blackout discipline Japanese forces maintained. One survivor, rescued after ditching his damaged Zero, told his rescuers, "They do not fear us. They show lights because they can afford to. Their ships have so much electrical power they waste it on convenience." When I saw that, I knew we could not win. Not because they are better warriors, we are equal in courage, but because they fight with reserves we cannot match. They can afford mistakes. We cannot. That is the difference between victory and defeat. The Pacific War became, in many ways, a contest between abundance and scarcity, between systems designed to tolerate waste and systems optimized for efficiency. Japan's strategic error was not attacking America. Reasonable arguments existed that conflict was eventually inevitable. Japan's error was believing that spiritual superiority and tactical excellence could offset material inferiority measured in orders of magnitude. The runway lights were merely the most visible symbol of that miscalculation, a symbol that burned itself into the consciousness of every Japanese serviceman who encountered it. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto survived the war. He spent 3 years in American custody, first in the Philippines, later in California. In 1947, during his repatriation processing, he participated in an extensive debriefing by strategic bombing survey historians. The transcript records his reflection on that January night in 1942. "I have thought about those lights every day since. In my cell at night, I remember them. When I try to sleep, I see them. They were not weapons, but they defeated me more completely than any weapon could. They showed me the truth I did not want to see, that Japan had challenged a nation so powerful it did not need to fear the dark. We had been taught that America was soft, weak, divided. But a soft nation does not flood the jungle with electric light just to make landings convenient. A weak nation does not waste fuel on comfort when fuel is precious. A divided nation does not build systems that assume abundance will continue forever." I landed on that runway and knew, in that moment, that everything I believed was wrong. Not wrong in detail, but wrong in its fundamental assumptions about the world. We had built our entire strategy on the idea that spirit could overcome steel, that discipline could outlast industry, that sacrifice could defeat wealth. And perhaps that is true when differences are small. But when one side has so much that it lights the night as if darkness does not exist, while the other side hoards every drop of fuel and every watt of power, the outcome is not in doubt. We simply refuse to admit what was obvious. The lights were not cruel. They did not mock us. They simply existed as facts exist. And facts, in the end, are more powerful than ideology. I fought for the emperor and would have died for him gladly. But I cannot fight against arithmetic. America had numbers Japan could not match. The lights proved it. Everything else was just delay. The runway lights at American airfields across the Pacific were never intended as psychological weapons. They were not designed to intimidate enemies or break morale. They were simply infrastructure, practical, standardized, mass-produced solutions to the operational problem of moving aircraft safely at night. but in their casual abundance, in the unstated assumption that fuel and electricity would always be available in quantities sufficient to make efficiency calculations irrelevant, they communicated a truth more powerful than any propaganda: that the war was a contest between societies operating from fundamentally different resource bases, and that material reality would ultimately determine outcomes regardless of courage, skill, or willingness to sacrifice. For Japanese forces encountering these installations, the lights became an unavoidable confrontation with that reality. Each illuminated runway, each floodlit maintenance area, each wastefully bright operations building served as evidence that the strategic premises of their war were bankrupt. Japan had attacked believing that a quick, decisive campaign could secure resources and establish a defensive perimeter before American mobilization overwhelmed them. But the lights showed that American abundance was not something that needed mobilization. It already existed, embedded in infrastructure built over decades, ready to deploy immediately. The tragedy, from the Japanese perspective, was that this information came too late. By the time pilots like Yamamoto saw the lights and understood their implications, the war had already passed the point where strategic revision could change outcomes. The decision to attack had been made. The forces had been committed. And the machine of war, once set in motion, ground forward regardless of whether its architects retained faith in its purpose. In this sense, the runway lights were not just a symbol of American material superiority. They were a symbol of the inexorable logic by which industrial capacity translates into strategic outcome. Wars between near peers can be decided by tactics, by leadership, by chance. But wars between nations separated by an order of magnitude in industrial output are decided before the first shot is fired. The only question is how long the materially weaker power can sustain the illusion that factors other than material supremacy matter. Japan sustained that illusion for 3 years and 8 months. Every battle, every tactical victory, every demonstration of courage and skill by Japanese forces was real and meaningful on its own terms. But set against the backdrop of American production, turning out a warship every 2 weeks, an aircraft every 5 minutes, a tank every 8 minutes, individual achievements dissolved into statistical noise. The runway lights, burning through tropical nights from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, illuminated that truth with pitiless clarity. There is a photograph, taken by a Navy combat photographer in August 1945, that captures something of this story. It shows a Japanese Zero fighter parked on the apron at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo, the base from which kamikaze squadrons had launched during the last months of the war. The photograph was taken at night, just after the surrender. In the background, American engineers have installed temporary lighting, portable floodlight units on trailers, their diesel generators humming, bathing the entire field in cold white light. The Zero sits in the foreground, its paint faded and patched, its canopy scratched, its tires worn nearly smooth. It is surrounded by light but seems diminished by it, as if the illumination exposes every failure and inadequacy. Behind it, American aircraft, C-47 transports, B-24 bombers, fighter squadrons, are parked in orderly rows, their metal skins gleaming. The photographer noted in his log that Japanese ground crew were watching from the field's edge, kept at a distance by military police. He wrote, "The Japs just stared at the lights. Some of them were crying. I asked my translator why, and he said they were crying because now they could see. I didn't understand then. I think I do now. They were seeing what they'd been fighting against. Not soldiers, not guns, but a country that could afford to make night into day, and did, just because it could." That image, of light revealing what darkness had hidden, serves as a fitting epilogue to the story of Japanese pilots stunned by American runway lights. The lights were never weapons in the conventional sense. They fired no shots, destroyed no targets, killed no enemies. But they won battles nonetheless, by the simple fact of existing, by demonstrating abundance where scarcity was expected, by making visible the material chasm that ideology could not bridge. In the end, the lights represented something more fundamental than military logistics or industrial capacity. They represented a philosophical divide between societies that understood power differently. Japan, shaped by centuries of resource scarcity on densely populated islands, had developed a culture that glorified efficiency, sacrifice, and making do with less. America, shaped by continental abundance and immigrant expansion, had developed a culture that treated surplus as normal and waste as affordable overhead. Neither approach was morally superior. Both reflected adaptations to different historical and geographical circumstances. But in the context of industrial war, one approach possessed overwhelming advantage. The society comfortable with abundance could mobilize its full strength without asking citizens to sacrifice beyond endurance. The society built on scarcity had to demand total sacrifice simply to field competitive forces, and total sacrifice is not sustainable indefinitely. The runway lights, burning through Pacific nights from 1942 to 1945, illuminated that asymmetry. They showed Japanese forces what they were fighting against, not merely a military, but an entire civilization oriented around material abundance so deep that even war could not exhaust it. And in showing that truth, they broke something more fundamental than morale or discipline. They broke the narrative that Japan could win, the story that courage and spirit would somehow prove sufficient. Facts have that power. They do not argue or persuade. They simply exist, forcing accommodation. And the fact illuminated by 10,000 runway lights across the Pacific was this: material reality constrains ideology, not the reverse. Japan had built its war strategy on the premise that will could overcome material disadvantage. The lights proved otherwise, night after night, one landing at a time, until even the most fervent believer had to confront the arithmetic of industrial war. That confrontation, individual, repeated across thousands of soldiers and pilots and sailors, accumulated over years of grinding combat, was how the psychological war was won. Not through propaganda, not through indoctrination, but through the simple accumulatio.